The 16 to 35mm wide-angle zoom lens is considered to be the go-to lens for landscape photographers. Now, that utterly depends on the landscapes that you are photographing, but there is no doubt that a wide-angle zoom lens should be part of every landscape photographer's toolkit. Hello everyone, my name is Mads Peter Iversen. I'm a Danish landscape photographer. This video is a 7-step guide on how to master and use your 16 to 35mm wide-angle zoom lens so you can elevate your landscape photography. Well, 16 to 35mm or thereabouts. And you definitely want to watch the entire video and stick around to the end for a couple of bonus tips. This video here is an upgraded version of my second most popular video on my channel of all time. It has more information and a better pacing. And although what I present in this video can sound a little bit formulaic, there are other ways to make powerful wide-angle lens photos. But let's get started. By now, there are so many wide-angle lenses on the market, and with mirrorless cameras becoming the standard, lens manufacturers now have wider opportunities to be innovative with their lens designs. And this means that this video covers all the different wide-angle lenses, not just the 16 to 35mm lens, although it is still the standard. If you're watching this video, you probably already own a wide-angle zoom lens. However, if you're looking for one, I have a few suggestions dependent on your brand. If you're shooting Nikon full frame, I'd go for the Nikon Z 14 to 35mm f4. With the Nikon 14 to 30mm, you do sacrifice a little in the long end relative to the 16 to 35mm, but those 2 extra millimeters in the wide end can, in my experience, make a huge difference. If you're shooting Canon full frame, you are in luck as you have access to a 14 to 35mm f4. And I would, without question, go for that lens. I have actually considered changing to Canon only because of that lens. Sadly, Sony, what I shoot with, is a bit lackluster in regard to breaking the conventional focal range. So here I would go with the 16 to 35 f4 PSAT lens. You don't get the extra 2mm in the wide end, but you do get a super sharp, very compact and light lens. I generally also go for f4 versions over f2.8 versions. The f4 versions are generally smaller, lighter, definitely cheaper, and usually as sharp as their counter 2.8 versions. If you are into astrophotography, I would also prioritize a fast prime like a 20mm f1.8 or 14mm f1.8 over a wide-angle zoom lens at f2.8. Alright, so let's get on to the meat of this video. First and foremost, it's very important that you actually understand what a wide-angle lens is and what it does and how it stands out compared to other lenses. Wide-angle lenses typically have a focal length of 35mm or less, which means that they have a wide field of view. The popular myth, and if you ask ChatGPT to explain what a wide-angle lens is good for, is that due to the wide field of view, a wide-angle lens is extra good for landscape photography because you can cover expansive landscapes. However, expansive landscapes usually also contain a lot of visual distractions, and that requires you to think even more about your composition as to exclude those distractions. I do have a couple of chapters on this in my ebooks on composition in landscape photography that you can get via the links down in the description of this video. And because the wide-angle lens covers so much visual information, it's important that you adapt holistic thinking. There are 2 interpretations of holistic thinking. Either see the scene in front of you as a whole, be aware of everything that is within your frame, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this means that the individual visual elements doesn't have to be particularly interesting in and of themselves, but added together, they make for a great photo. Just like individual puzzle pieces aren't interesting in and of themselves, but added together, they make for a full picture. The whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. In this photo, I have a waterfall, a river, a car crossing the river, and a background mountain. Each on their own, they're not super interesting, but adding them together, it gives a sense of adventure and a cohesive photo. And in this example, we have a road, some mountains, an island, and a sunset. All common and non-interesting elements in themselves, but added together in a strong composition like this, where the road leads down the valley into the photo towards the background island, perfectly placed in the middle between the two mountain sides with the sunset lighting up the scene in the most gorgeous colors, makes for a super aesthetic photo captured at the right moment. I of course have many other examples of wide-angle lens photos, but the point being that the entire photo has to make sense. The powerfulness of a photo usually comes from a dramatic depth. The feeling of 3D, where it almost feels as if the photo is puking the foreground into the face of the viewer. This effect can be accomplished by getting close to a foreground. I mean really close. Wide-angle lenses gives a perception of distant objects being far away, and likewise by moving closer to your foreground elements, make them huge relative to the background, and this can create a more immersive experience with a great sense of depth. But be careful, this technique can distort the sense of scale of the landscape. You may end up with a powerful photo because the foreground is so much in your face, but you may also sacrifice the impact of the scale of the scene. And as mentioned, there are other ways to make impactful wide-angle lens photos, but this is the most common. So in this next step, when you have found the scene you want to photograph, composition is key. You can change your composition by zooming in and zooming out, changing your perspective up and down, tilting the lens and moving your feet. Due to the nature of a wide-angle lens and you being close to the foreground, even a few centimeters back and forward or right or left can make a huge difference. When making these types of photos, I either use the classic rule of thirds composition, where I place my subject in one of the upper third intersection points, and this is important, places my foreground subject in the opposite intersection point. And this is for the sake of the balance of the photo. You generally do not want to compromise on balance when aiming for aesthetically pleasing photos. If I do not use the intersection points of the rule of thirds, I generally go for a central composition where I place my subject in the middle of the upper third line and foreground in the lower thirds, occasionally the other way around. Besides the placement of my subjects or elements, I generally use loads of leading lines to either lead the viewer's eye through the photo or towards my subject. Here it's all about placing yourself so natural features of the landscape lines up. I also use framing to draw attention to the subjects. The frame can also help with that 3D feeling of the photo, or reflections for added visual interest. If I do use reflections, I tend to not only make a clean reflection, but I either break the reflection, introduce more foreground to achieve that powerful look, or let the reflection be a feature of the landscape in the midground. Leading lines, reflections, scale, depth, balance, centered or off-centered compositions, and much more are all compositional tools I cover in my 2 ebooks on composition. If you struggle with composition, definitely check them out. They're easy to read with loads of examples as to get to the point fast. And there are links to both of them down in the description of the video. And in this next step, when you have found your composition, wait for the proper conditions, or maybe go to the place when the conditions are proper and then compose your photo. For a powerful landscape photo, you generally also need some powerful conditions, or at the very least, dramatic conditions. As much as I love this photo with the strong depth of the heather in the foreground, the atmospheric conditions and the blue sky in the background, it doesn't really convey drama or power. If we take a look at this photo instead, the dramatically lit clashing waves, mountains and clouds convey much more power. The same is the case in this photo and in this photo. Moody clouds also help if there is a substantial amount of texture in them. You can also make powerful photos in a forest, like in this example with the foreground gnarly tree trunk and sunbeams breaking through the canopy, or in this photo with the foreground with wild garlic and background light in the forest. I'm not saying you can't make powerful photos with the blue sky, like in these examples, but it surely does help. And that is what these photos have in common, is that there's actually something of interest in the sky, like clouds or a rainbow. Now, once you've figured out all these things, the next step is to actually take the photo and dial in the settings. If you have a bit of distance between the camera and the foreground, the good thing about the wide-angle lens is that it is easy to get everything in focus in one exposure, even with a relatively open aperture. Personally, I tend to focus about 1/3 into the scene at an optimal aperture, where I take the sharpness of the given aperture, the shutter speed it can provide, and the depth of field into consideration. As my 16 to 35mm f4 PZ lens is the most sharp from f5.6 to f11-ish, I try to use those apertures although I in several situations do not mind sacrificing a bit of sharpness for the sake of having everything in focus in one exposure. If I either zoom a bit in with the wide-angle lens to something like 35mm or have the lens very close to the foreground, I generally try to focus stack the photo. What exact settings depends on your focal length and the distance to the foreground. And with more and more modern cameras, you can also use focus bracketing. Focus bracketing lets the camera change the plane of focus and takes the different exposures for you. These exposures you can combine in post-processing. If I am very close to the foreground, even with a wide focal length like 16mm, I do sometimes stop down my aperture beyond f11. The more close down the aperture is, the less photos I'll need for the focus stack because the plane of focus is deeper and I have more overlay between the individual exposures. This makes stitching the photos together in post-processing much easier, especially if the foreground is relatively complex like in this photo. If you want to know more about settings and how to get a proper exposure, be sure to check out the video up in the corner. And the final step is post-processing, but remember to stick around for the 2 bonus tips. Once you've taken the photo, it is time for post-processing. Regarding focus stacking, I generally prefer to do it manually in Photoshop by masking in the different sections of the photos I need. If it is a bit more of a complex scene, I try to give Photoshop a chance of stitching the different photos together. However, it doesn't always do a particularly great job. There are ways to get around this, which I cover in my Photoshop course, but if it's a really complex scene, I may need to use a dedicated focus stacking software. If your wide-angle lens isn't wide enough, you can also make panoramas. Besides adding to the resolution of the photo, you effectively also widen your focal length. In this example, I simply just handheld the camera and took several photos, which I combined into a panorama in Camera Raw. You can do the same in Lightroom. Just select the different photos you want to make into a panorama at once, right-click and then choose Stitch Panorama. I have a dedicated video for that too on my channel. For powerful photos, I generally add a decent amount of contrast. Contrasty images tend to draw attention and make an impact. I generally try to have both a black point and a white point as to use the entire dynamic range and spread out the histogram as much as possible. For most landscape scenes, I tend to first reduce the contrast by lifting my shadows and reducing my highlights, and from there I add contrast via the contrast slider, the curves tool, the black and white sliders, and of course with different masks and gradients. My editing philosophy is generally to make impactful photos, but also respect the light. And you can learn much more about that in my huge 30+ videos post-processing course. In this course I share all my editing techniques, everything from adding and controlling glow and atmosphere, cleaning my photos properly, editing with luminosity masks to avoid the pitfalls of HDR photos, focus stacking, and much more. You can save a bit of money with the coupon code that you can find along with the link to the course down in the description of the video. And as promised, a couple of bonus tips. Wide-angle lenses can introduce distortion, especially at the edges of the frame. Be mindful of this when composing your photos. Sometimes a bit of distortion adds character, but if it's too much, you can correct it in post-processing like this. And the second bonus tip, a polarizing filter can be problematic when you use it with a wide-angle lens, because the wide-angle lens is going to show you more than the polarized part of the sky, which means that the polarized part of the sky will be a darker blue band in your photo. You will have to compensate for this in post-processing, or you will need to angle yourself and zoom a bit in so you only use the polarized part of the sky. If you want to learn even more, be sure to use the links down in the description of this video for my post-processing course and composition ebooks. Thanks for watching and see you next time.